All right, now to make sense of what is happening at this moment at the front lines between Russia and Ukraine, we're being joined by retired Colonel Rich Outzen, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation, and he's joining us live from Washington, D.C. on this broadcast. Now, Colonel Outzen, we are looking at what is happening at this moment on the front lines where the Russians seem to have stepped up their attacks. They've almost certainly surrounded Avdiivka, an industrial hub there. Why are we witnessing this sharp uptick in Russian activity along the front lines now?
Well, it's good to be with you, Mohammed. I think that there's a strong political element to the timing of what's going on. This stepped-up Russian offensive. Avdiivka is, in a sense, sort of like Bakhmut was last year. It's a symbol to the Russians of progress in their offensive, and it's a symbol to the Ukrainians of a stubborn defense. Now, the Russians ended up taking Bakhmut, but at a very high cost, and I think Avdiivka is very similar. There's been a huge disparity in the number of losses on both sides. Russia's paying a huge price for this, and yet they are essentially succeeding in undermining the defense. I think it's likely that they will take Avdiivka. The question of whether that was worth the price will remain open. The real timing issue here, though, is not just to take the town. The timing issue is because the American political season is heating up, with the Republican side arguing for more caution with regards to military aid to Ukraine. And I think the Russian calculus is strike a big blow, inflict a lot of punishment with these drone attacks, and convince the Americans to lean on Kyiv to negotiate a peace.
You know, it's interesting that you say that because at this moment the United States is mired in its own domestic politics and therefore is not sending more aid. But the fact is, for the last 2 years, the Americans have been backing the Ukrainians with military and other financial aid. The European Union has passed a $50 billion funding bill, but that's going more for administrative and other purposes and not necessarily to ramp up the Ukrainian war efforts. Has the West's appetite for war at this moment, do you think, waned because of what has happened on the battlefield?
Well, I wouldn't phrase it as appetite. Really, it's assessment. I think in a hard power world, and the Russians and the Chinese, the Iranians, others, not just the Americans, know that this is a hard power world. And certainly the Europeans have relearned that lesson. So what that means is when you see a regional power, or global power really in the case of Russia, that's willing to launch a massive offensive to try to extinguish a nation next to it, the other countries in the region have to pay attention. Now, a country like the United States, knowing that there's places it might come into conflict with China, with Iran, with Russia, should do everything in its power to disincentivize Russia from trying this sort of thing again. And if you look at Putin's writings and ramblings about history, there's no guarantee that Ukraine will be the end. So I don't think it's so much appetite for war in the West. It's a recognition that Putin has to come out of this bloodied and failed, and that's a worthy investment, or we'll be fighting him probably in Central Europe.
Now, Colonel Outzen, just to play the devil's advocate here, the Russian President Vladimir Putin says that it is important that the West also should recognize the red lines for Russia. And what has happened, according to him, he says that the frontiers of the NATO military alliance have been moving eastwards, and that is why Russia is fighting this war, he claims, in self-defense to guard the security interests of Russia. And he's also said that he's in fact willing to sit down and negotiate, and he's asking the American President Joe Biden, perhaps now in the most recent interviews, that it is up to the Americans to let the Ukrainian leadership know that this is now the right time to negotiate. Do you think is that what is now going to happen, because the Americans are no longer funding and helping Ukraine in this war, that the Ukrainians might now be forced to negotiate with Russia?
Well, that's certainly what Putin wants. And as you've stated, that's what he is calling upon President Biden to do. I think it would be a mistake. I for one, and by the way, it's not all Republicans and not all conservatives that are against military aid to Ukraine, but I think negotiations have to happen. But I come from the hard powers and realpolitik school that says you negotiate, but while you're negotiating, you continue to punch. So I think it would be a huge mistake to let military aid run out to Ukraine while negotiating, because that guarantees you'll get a bad negotiation and a bad deal. Instead, I think we ramp up the assistance and make sure they can successfully defend at the same time that we're negotiating. Yeah, now Russia says we have prompted their action by moving eastward, but the fact is there's never been a threat to Russian territory. There's never been any even implied threat from NATO to Russian territory. It's a threat to his imperial ambitions. So I guess in that sense, he's telling the truth.
I'm not sure how many Russians would agree with that, but thank you very much indeed, Colonel Outzen, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
Good to be with you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.